In his final address to the United Nations General Assembly as US President, Joe Biden has called for an end to current global conflicts. He spoke about the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza and said a diplomatic solution to the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah was still possible. The president also warned that Iran must never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. But there was also optimism as he looked back on his decades in politics.
I know many look at the world today and see difficulties and react with despair, but I do not. I won't. As leaders, we don't have the luxury. I recognize the challenges from Ukraine to Gaza to Sudan and beyond. War, hunger, terrorism, brutality, record displacement of people, a climate crisis, democracy at risk, strains within our societies, the promise of artificial intelligence and its significant risk. The list goes on. But maybe because all I've seen and all we have done together over the decades, I have hope. I know there is a way forward.
Let's get more from our correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, who joins us from outside the UN headquarters in New York. Welcome, Ben. Was that the president's main message today, hope?
It was indeed a message of hope, while at the same time acknowledging multiple crises. We just heard that he mentioned some of them, and that's been a theme also for his last speeches here at the UN General Assembly. He warned against what he called a full-scale war in the Middle East, saying that even though the situation has escalated, a diplomatic solution is still possible. And with Russia's war in Ukraine, but also the crisis in the Middle East is taking center stage, not just with his speech, but also with other speeches like Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, who will address the General Assembly in the next couple of days.
And what else stood out for you?
So this was rather personal. It was a try also by President Biden to cement the legacy of his foreign policy. So he started his speech by joking about his age, then also said that it's when he took the decision to not run for re-election again, moving the way, of course, to Kamala Harris, the vice president, and also now the presidential candidate, the nominee from the Democratic Party. So is this one of his last chances to address world leaders here? This is his final address, and there won't be many more opportunities for him to have so many leaders, more than 140 presidents, prime ministers, kings who are attending the General Assembly here. So it was a lot also about his legacy and looking forward about what could happen in the next couple of years, with next year either President Trump or President Harris taking the stage here in New York.
And what are we expecting next from this gathering?
So the next speeches that are up today, we have the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who will speak here. The address that we already had opening this session was by the president of the General Assembly and also by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, saying that there are a lot of countries not facing any accountability. And of course, that's a message that goes to many of the leaders who will address the UNGA on the next couple of days. This will go on. We had the Summit of the Future over the last couple of days. Now we'll have this high week here at the UNGA with many more speeches coming up. And of course, the crisis in Ukraine, in Gaza, and the occupied West Bank, and in southern Lebanon, taking central stage here.
OK, thanks for that, Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber in New York. Well, President Biden spoke at length about the war in Gaza. He called on Israel and Hamas to accept a proposed peace deal and for an immediate ceasefire to bring the remaining hostages home.
The world must not flinch from the horrors of October 7th. Any country would have the right and responsibility to ensure that such an attack can never happen again. Thousands of armed Hamas terrorists invaded a sovereign state, slaughtering and massacring more than 1,200 people, including 46 Americans, in their homes and at a music festival. Despicable acts of sexual violence, 250 innocents taken hostage. I've met with the families of those hostages. I've grieved with them. They're going through hell. Innocent civilians in Gaza are also going through hell. thousands and thousands of kills, including aid workers. Too many families dislocated, crowding into tents, facing a dire humanitarian situation. They did not ask for this war that Hamas started. I put forward with Qatar and Egypt a ceasefire and hostage deal. It's been endorsed by the UN Security Council. Now is the time for the parties to finalize its terms, bring the hostages home, and secure security for Israel and Gaza free of Hamas' grip, ease the suffering in Gaza, and end this war.
Let's join our Chief International Editor, Richard Walker, in Washington. Welcome, Richard. So we heard the President there talking about Gaza. Lots of tension increasing in Lebanon at the moment. Did that get a look in?
Yeah, that's right, Phil. So Biden did make a pretty brief mention of the situation with Hezbollah and Lebanon, and saying that a full-scale war is not in anybody's interest, which is very much the US point of view, and the point of view of also obviously many of the leaders who are sitting there in the chamber with him in New York. I think this, though, points to a sense of the limits of US influence and power in the Middle East that has been quite exposed by the last year or so. That we see the United States, as we heard from Joe Biden, they're saying that, earlier in the year, it finally, after holding back on that for a long period, did call for a ceasefire in Gaza, and that has still not come about. So despite the urgent calls of the United States, despite the imprimatur of the UN Security Council also on that plan, that has not happened. And now we see the prospect of a significant escalation on a second front up towards Lebanon. And I think many leaders wondering, well, Joe Biden can stand there and say that a full-scale war won't help anybody, but that could still be what happens. So the days ahead, of course, will be pretty crucial on that, what we actually see developing on that front. And we've also heard, of course, that we expect Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, to come and speak later in the week. Mahmoud Abbas, we saw in the footage there, is already in New York. The question of whether Netanyahu really shows up if the situation deteriorates further is still an open question. But yeah, all eyes very much on that conflict, and the Lebanon situation is still a fairly brief mention in Biden's speech.
The war in Ukraine was centre stage at last year's General Assembly. Not so this year, but it did still get a mention.
Yeah, that's right. And Biden, really underlining that the US believes that it must stick by Ukraine. It cannot relent in its support. It cannot start to kind of get the fatigue that many have worried about. We're expecting, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, also to address the UN General Assembly. That's coming up tomorrow. Certainly, the situation in the Middle East has contributed to this sort of slipping of the Ukraine war a little bit into the background in the UN context. And I think it has also made life more difficult for the Ukrainians in terms of drumming up international support, because there is a significant sense in the wider international community of double standards by the West and the United States in particular, feeling that the United States is not applying the same standards to the war in the Middle East that it applies to the war in Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians facing perhaps a bit more of an uphill battle than they did in the early stages of that invasion by the Russians to really rally international support behind it on a war that, of course, it continues to suffer the consequences from.
So we heard a lot from the President about his time as an elected representative, very much his swan song at this gathering. Did we get a good representation of his legacy?
Well, I think, Joe Biden, when he came in, he was greeted pretty much with open arms by the international community who, of course, in the Trump era that preceded Biden, were quite shocked by the steps that Trump took against the very idea of international cooperation that the United Nations stands for, and the biggest example perhaps of that being his pulling out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, which was seen as a real sort of slap in the face for global efforts to tackle climate change. So Biden was very much welcomed, I think, internationally in those early stages, and the way that you remember his slogan in his first year was "America is back" on the global stage. But I think the legacy that people see now is more mixed, partly because of what we've just been talking about, the situation in the Middle East. And then this big question mark of, well, is part of Biden's legacy going to be that Donald Trump gets re-elected here? That's really the open question that's hanging over this weekend in New York.
Thanks for that, Richard. DW's chief international editor, Richard Walker in Washington.